minds when they see war and want to go back to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward Yam Suf.
When the Israelites left Egypt, the question of where they went is, again, a difficult question. We know the names of some of the places that they reached on their journey to Mount Sinai, but most of those places cannot be identified today on the ground. We don't find signposts saying 5 miles to such a place or welcome to this place to tell us. So in a few cases, we may find similarities in the names that still exist today to the ancient names and suggest that they're the same places, but it's very hard to prove. And of course, people moving, as the Israelites did, from Egypt to Mount Sinai, are not going to leave relics for us to find to, as it were, trace their footsteps. So it's a matter, to a large extent, of hypothesis, which route they took.
Well, if we talk about the story of the Exodus, they were told not to go this way. They were told not to go this way, which was called the way of the Philistines?
Right, or way of the land of the Philistines.
Okay.
Typically, roads in the ancient world were named based on the destination point. So that if you were going from Egypt to Canaan, the destination point would be the name. So the land of the Philistines, of course, is the southern corner of the ancient coast of Canaan. And so this would be that route that the Bible tells us the Israelites did not go on, lest they see war and turn back. We now, thanks to a combination of the geological work that's been done, archaeological work that's been done, we can now shed light on that picture.
The question is, did the Israelites go on this road or not? The answer also impacts whether the miraculous crossing of Yam Suf happened near Egypt, at one of the border lakes, or far from Egypt, at the Gulf of Aqaba. The Egyptian view has popularized the idea that the crossing happened near Egypt at a shallow lake area. Does the Hebrew text, make that a possibility when you read the Hebrew?
A handful of responses. Number one, the text makes explicit that God told Israel, you're not going to go a northern route along the Mediterranean coast, the way of the Philistines. You're not going to go that way to the promised land, even though it was the closest. And the reason it says is so that you will not want to return.
And if they would have went up to those lakes up towards the north, they would have been going the very way.
That would have been the very way that God verbally declared, you shall not go this way. And to think that God would have altered his reflections would have gone against his purpose. He didn't want them to be so close to Egypt that they could easily turn around. So wherever we look for the region of the water crossing, we need to recognize it can't be near Egypt, because God didn't want them to be so close that they'd want to return. And he says it's not going to be by way of the Philistines, because that way is near Egypt.
But those in the Egyptian approach are split about whether they actually went on the northern road or not.
We know that Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 says to the Israelites, it says to Moses, when you leave, do not take the way to the land of the Philistines. Well, we know that the Egyptians had a whole series of forts along that road. It's the equivalent of an interstate highway. Not that it was paved and patrolled and lighted and so forth. I don't mean that. In that it was a major international roadway. By roadway, I mean pathway. There are times, I'm sure, when because of the season, it got clogged with mud and roots and growth and so forth. But it's a major transportation artery.
So they weren't going to go north.
Well, I'm assuming that this prohibition was necessary. Mm-hmm. All we know is that there's a prohibition. Do not take, this is Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. So when you leave, do not take that road. All right, I think the reason for the prohibition, we have to deduce something here. It would seem to me that the natural deduction would be that were it not for that prohibition, that's the way they would have taken, because that would be the shortest way into the land.
But they were supposed to go to the mountain first. That's the thing that doesn't make sense.
Exodus 13:17 doesn't tell them where to go. I mean, yes, in principially it does, but at this point it's just simply saying don't go He may not use that road.
Yeah.
All right, that suggests to me that they're going to be following a regular road and not some novel creation. They're not going to try to outwit the Pharaoh, try to wind all over the place and try to outwit the guy and get out, under false pretenses.
Those taking the Hebrew approach for the geography agree that the biblical text not only implies that God told them not to go by the way of the northern road, it explicitly says they didn't go that way. They also emphasize the initial destination of the journey.
Where are they going? Well, they're going to Mount Sinai, and that has to be brought into this too. They're going to Mount Sinai because early on, when God introduced himself to Moses at the burning bush, the sign that God was truly behind all this was that the people will worship me at this mountain. That's their destination.
However, even this point is disputed. Many in the Egyptian approach emphasize the ultimate goal of the Exodus journey, which was the Promised Land, and de-emphasize the initial destination of Mount Sinai.
They were forced north.
Egyptologist David Rohl favors a crossing at the northern Bala Lakes, along the northern road known by the Egyptians as the Way of Horus. One thing I want to bring up is that it says that they weren't supposed to go north. It says they weren't supposed to go the way of the Philistines, which is along the Mediterranean.
That's right.
So how do you explain that?
Well, they don't start off that way, do they? They go from the city of Avaris or Ramses in Goshen. The way of the Philistines is in this direction over here, but they don't go. They go across the Midbar Yam Suf over here because Moses is intending to take them on this road we call the Way of Shur, which goes to the Promised Land. That was his original intention.
They're heading over to Midian, right?
No, Midian's right down here. You can't tell me that. The Way of Shur goes to Beersheba, which is up here,
okay,
and then on to Hebron. And it's used by the patriarchs. Abraham used that route. When Joseph brought the body of Jacob, he took him along the Way of Shur to Hebron, where he was buried in Machpelah Cave. So we know where that route is. That would have been the route that Moses would have planned to take them on. And of course, God tells him to turn back. And he turns them back in order to take them into the danger zone because he wants to perform the miracle of destroying the army. That's the whole point of it.
At the Red Sea?
Yeah. No. At the Yam Suf.
At the Yam Suf. Biblical researcher Jodel Onstadt takes a Hebrew approach. I know that they're trying to basically say, well, they left from Ramses, from the area of Goshen, and they went to Sukkoth, and then they turned and they got stuck up there in this area where the canals are. So you don't see much support of that from a biblical narrative?
No, if you look at the northern part of the Sinai is very, very sandy. Geologically it's called like sand dunes. And so it's very hard to walk with a caravan of people through sand dunes. Richard Friedman, in one of his recent books on the Exodus, talks about how a Jeep from the 1967 war is today something like under 30 feet of sand. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's very hard to walk. And then if you have carts, as what the Exodus account says, it's really hard to push or pull a cart. So it would have been very, very hampered.
You're talking about in that northern part of Egypt?
Quadrant.
In that Wadi Tumilat area? Or, I mean, up in that, not the Wadi Tumilat, but north of that?
Even north of that, as you go closer to what would have been geographically that Way of the Philistines or Way of Horus, or even if you would have gone, under that, as people will often, scholars will say, if they're going to say Har Karkum, in that direction, it makes for a very arduous travel.
The biblical clues for the route and circumstances of the Exodus are the following. The Hebrews were well organized. They were unarmed at the departure from Egypt, and the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire showed the way. And the Hebrews, they walked day and night. It is stated that they were in the wilderness, and that's important. We don't talk about the desert like the Sahara Desert. We talk about going on very solid ground, gravel-like ground that was very solid to walk on or to drive on today, or similar to a street actually, very solid ground. The direction from Egypt was not towards the north. That's very clearly stated. And since they were crossing the wilderness of the Red Sea, we know that they went in a kind of eastern direction, but not northeast. And we know also that they crossed or walked through the wilderness of the Red Sea. It means the land that was surrounded by the Red Sea, the two arms of the Red Sea. We also know from the text that they crossed the Egyptian border the same day. The same day they started their journey, they crossed the border.
However, those using the Egyptian approach believe the strength of the Egyptian place name interpretations mandates a crossing at the lakes of Egypt's border.
After the Bible tells us that they didn't go out this way, we're told instead they head in the direction of Sukkot. That's in both in Exodus 12:37 and also in Numbers chapter 33, where we have a place-by-place campsite itinerary. So you can see that they're heading towards the other way out of Egypt. There were two ways in and out of Egypt, one on the coast and the other following this route out into central Sinai. So it looks like that's the direction they were heading, towards what the Bible calls Sukkot. I should just add that this area was known in ancient Egypt as Cheku. Cheku linguistically corresponds to Hebrew Sukkot. And so it seems that they're clearly moving in this direction, at least initially trying to avoid this area. They come to this area and they're on the edge of the wilderness. They're about to leave Egypt. Exodus 13:20 tells us, and then suddenly they make a turn. Exodus 14:1 and 2 indicates a turn, and the word shuv means to turn back. Did they turn more to the east or a little bit more to the west? But clearly they're heading back to the very area they were originally trying to avoid. What's puzzling is why they would originally avoid this route and now apparently head back up to it. But it doesn't make sense to me, but it does make sense in terms of following the geography of the text, and that much I'm stuck with.